Japanese warships had one reliable way to tell their own fighter pilots where the American planes were coming from. They aimed their heaviest guns at the incoming aircraft and fired in that direction, and the pilots looked for the shell bursts and flew toward them. This was the Imperial Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. None of it was incompetence. It was the best a first-rate Navy could manage. Screening ships threw up their main batteries not to hit anything, but to draw a bearing across the sky, because a column of bursting shells was the fastest way to hand a formation of zeros a direction to fly. The carriers spread their formations wide to push the lookouts farther apart and squeeze a few more miles of warning out of human eyes. In the middle of the 20th century, the primary air defense sensor of the most powerful carrier fleet on Earth was a man on a bridge who could see. A few hundred miles of the same ocean away, the United States Navy was working out how to do something its enemy would not match for the rest of the war. It was not a better gun or a faster airplane. It was a room, a cramped, blacked-out compartment down below the bridge, lit in dim red, crowded with radar screens and plotting boards and men in headphones. And its whole purpose was to take everything the ship could detect and hear and fold it into a single moving picture, then tell every gun and every pilot where to look. They named it the Combat Information Center. On the first ships to have one, it had no name at all. It was the place where the radar plot happened to live, and the story of how it grew into the thing that won battles begins not with a blueprint, but with one officer standing in a doorway in the dark, reading a glowing screen while men were dying on the water around him. The sea off Guadalcanal in late 1942 was the worst water in the world for a ship's captain. The fighting came at night, at knife range, in channels barely wide enough to turn a cruiser. Radar was new, and most captains neither trusted it nor knew what to do with the torrent of numbers it produced. A surface search set could report a contact at a bearing and a range. It could not say whether that contact was an enemy destroyer, a friendly ship, or the shoreline of an island. Somebody had to hold the entire picture in one head in the blackness while the ship heeled into a turn and the guns went off and reports flooded in from the lookouts and the radio and the sound room faster than any single man on the bridge could take them in. Aboard the destroyer USS Fletcher, in the naval battle off Guadalcanal in November of 1942, her executive officer answered the problem by planting himself where he could watch the radar with his own eyes. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Wiley stood at the edge of the radar room, studied the surface search display, built in his mind a map of where every ship sat and where each was heading, and spoke that map down a sound-powered phone line to the captain and the gun crews, walking them onto targets he could see as nothing more than blooms of light. Commander William Cole, his captain, trusted that red enough to open fire on it before the order came down through the usual channels. The setup was crude, it was improvised, and it worked. Fletcher fought that action with a thing none of her sisters had. One mind assigned to nothing except the radar picture, feeding it straight to the men on the triggers. The whole idea of the dark room was born there by accident, in a single night. Nimitz had been hunting for exactly this. That same November, while Wiley was improvising off Guadalcanal, the Pacific Fleet commander put out a tactical bulletin telling every ship to establish what he called a combat operations center, a single place to gather and weigh information from every source aboard. The order named the need. It said nothing about how to build the thing, and that took another year and a good deal of arguing. Admiral King's staff in Washington laid out the anatomy. A real center had to run at least 4 separate plots at once. One for the ship's own navigation, one for surface contacts, one for aircraft, and one devoted to steering fighters. It needed radar repeaters, bearing rings, timers, and its own short-range voice radio for talking to other ships. King ordered that the compartment be built with 30% more room than the job seemed to need, on the conviction that the work would swell to fill it. The space filled inside a year. Doctrine on paper still needed people who could run it. The Navy already had a fighter director school at Pearl Harbor, and as the centers spread, it was renamed the Fighter Director and Combat Information Center School and pushed to turn out far more graduates. Radar men learned the trade at schools stood up for the purpose, at St. Simon's Island in Georgia and at Hollywood Beach in Florida. The training reached past the single ship, too. Wherever it could be managed, The centers of a task group were wired into one another over permanent voice circuits, so that the plot on a flagship carried the lookout reports of the smallest destroyer escort at the far edge of the screen. A raid spotted by one ship became, within seconds, a raid every ship in the formation could see. The old arrangement, where each captain fought his own ship on what his own crew could observe, was quietly giving way to something that reacted as a fleet. Someone had to set it all down on paper. What came out was a thin manual, around 25 pages, thrown together at Pearl Harbor in about 6 weeks and issued on the 24th of June, 1943 as the CIC Handbook for Destroyers, over the name of Admiral Mahlon Tisdale. 1,500 copies ran off the press, and they went not to the American fleet alone, but to the Royal Navy as well, since the British had been chewing on the same puzzle from their own direction, and there was no sense in two navies solving it twice over. Nimitz saw the handbook out to every ship that could use it. That last detail deserves a moment, because the clean version of this story, the one where American genius conjures the information room out of thin air, is not quite honest. The idea had roots in Britain's Royal Navy, which had long insisted on giving its admirals proper space and settled procedures for following a fight. The Royal Air Force had already built the first great information filter of the war, the system that saved Britain in 1940, pulling radar tracks and ground observer reports into one central hall and pushing intercepts back out. The Americans did not invent the concept. What they did was take it to sea, on hundreds of hulls at once, and turn it into mass production. The carriers that arrived from 1943 on were not guessing. Their designers had laid the centers out around the hard lessons of the year before, the night actions off Guadalcanal and the carrier battles of 1942, where good ships went down in part because no one aboard could put together fast enough what the ship already knew. The room came built in now, radars and all. It was kept dark on purpose. Red light does less damage to night vision than white, so a man could step from the plotting table to a scope to a hatch out onto a black deck without going blind in the switch, and the red glow threw no reflection across the glass of the display faces. Along the after wall stood the radar and sonar scopes. Along the forward wall sat the plots and the status boards. The talkers worked the middle, relaying by voice over a dozen numbered phone circuits, and above all of it presided an evaluator whose one job was to decide what the picture meant. On the smaller ships, that officer was often the exec, filling the role as a stopgap, because the Navy had decided the job wanted a tactically experienced hand and did not yet have enough of them to go around. Aboard the ship itself, the center was off limits to most of the crew, its worth understood well enough that few hands who did not work there ever went inside. What all of it bought at bottom was time, since American air search radar could pick up a formation of aircraft 50 miles out and more, which at the closing speed of the planes gave a fighter direct something on the order of 20 minutes to get his fighters up, sorted, and pointed. That was the margin between meeting a raid out where it could be broken apart and being caught on the deck with the aircraft still climbing. The men doing the work were, in a great many cases, civilians who had been wearing business suits a year and a half before. The Navy's own account of one carrier's center, the USS Wasp, lists the crew it ran at one point: a college professor, a graduate student in forestry, a high school principal, a meat salesman, a lawyer, an insurance salesman, and a fresh college graduate. Not one of them was trained for combat in the old sense of the word. They had been taught a brand new job that had not existed when they enlisted, and they were running the nerve center of a warship in battle. There is something in that roster the medals and the gun camera footage never quite capture. The idea itself had a stranger pedigree than the Navy liked to admit. One of the American officers who pushed hardest to build these centers said afterward, without softening it, that he had lifted the concept straight out of pulp science fiction, from a run of space opera novels in which a command ship coordinated a whole fleet from a single plotting tank. The claim sits in a private letter written in 1947, and it is odd enough to be true. They even built one that never went to sea. A vessel named Moosehead was fitted out as a floating classroom, a stationary mock-up of a combat center, where crews could rehearse the whole choreography before they took it into an actual fight. Now back across the water, because the claim in the title is exact and it has to be handled with care. The Japanese were not fools, and they were not blind for lack of trying. They had radar, they had capable engineers and working sets on their ships. At Midway itself, the fleet's first two experimental sets had gone to sea aboard the battleships East and Huga, and both had sailed north with the Aleutian diversion, hundreds of miles from the carriers being bombed. Their failure was not one of hardware. As one careful history of the subject puts it, their weakness in the electronics was made worse by their failure to build the command and control that would have turned the information into an answer. They could get a contact on a screen. What they never built was the room around it, the trained crews, the plots, the doctrine that turned a blip into a fighter sitting at the right height in the right patch of sky before the raid arrived. Their own procedures fought against them. Japanese prisoners told American interrogators after capture that their early warning sets were switched off the moment Allied aircraft closed to within about 10 miles on the reasoning that a transmitting radar was a lighthouse an attacker could steer straight in on. So the radar went dark at the moment it was needed most. The Navy also ordered its ships to keep their sets shut down under radio silence, a rule that stood until 1944, which drained the early warning value out of the equipment they did have. When one of their few purpose-built radar picket ships, the Yamakibo Maru, was lost at Truk in November of 1943, it knocked a hole in a program that had no margin for holes. Why the enemy never closed the gap is not a settled question, and the honest answer is a tangle rather than a single cause. Part of it was a shortage of the high-grade components the sets needed. Some of it was that radar engineers were pulled into uniform and thrown into the fighting, spending talent the program could not spare. Their aircraft radios were too weak and too few to run a real fighter direction net, even if the ground picture had existed. And underneath all of it ran a service culture that had staked a generation of training on the skill of the individual night fighting pilot and the trained human eye, and was slow to hand that trust to a screen. To a screen. Historians who have worked the sources weigh these against each other in different ways, and no one cause accounts for the rest. All of it fell due on the morning of the 19th of June, 1944, in the sea west of the Mariana Islands. Task Force 58 had 15 carriers and something close to 900 aircraft, and it was screened by a system the enemy could not have assembled if they had wanted to. Radar caught the incoming raids far out. Fighter directors sitting in the carriers' darkened centers vectored the combat air patrol onto the attackers while they were still miles from the ships, sending Hellcats to the right bearing and the right altitude to be waiting when the raid arrived. Anything that slipped past the fighters ran into a wall of anti-aircraft fire from the screening battleships and cruisers, much of it now tipped with the new proximity fuse that made a near miss as deadly as a direct hit. The steering of the fighters, the piece that decided where they would be, happened in the room. Days before the main battle, a lieutenant running the center on the carrier Hornet had caught enemy scout planes on his screens and put fighters onto them, killing the first snooper 47 miles out from the force. On the morning of the 19th, his operators picked up the enemy launching from Guam, and the interceptors were overhead and ready before the attack could form. And then there was the thing that happened aboard the Lexington, which sounds made up and is not. A junior lieutenant named Charles Sims sat in the flagship's blacked-out center with a radio and a rare skill. He spoke fluent Japanese. Above the sea, the enemy strike coordinator was circling and calling instructions to his own pilots, giving them headings and altitudes and the moment to begin their runs. Sims listened, translated it as it came, and passed it to the American fighter directors, who now knew where the attack was going before it got there. Someone in the room proposed sending fighters out to shoot the coordinator down. Cooler heads refused. The man was worth far more alive and talking, narrating his own side's attack to the people getting ready to destroy it, and so he was left circling and broadcast through the whole slaughter that followed. The account survives in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official history of the war at sea. What followed earned a nickname that stuck. Japanese carrier aviation lost on the order of 350 planes on the 19th alone, and something near 480 across the 2 days of fighting. American fighters lost fewer than 24 of their own in the air. Of the intercepts flown that day, all but 5 were made by Hellcats. A pilot climbing out of his cockpit back aboard the Lexington said it had been just like an old-time turkey shoot, and the phrase went around the fleet and into the history books. One Hellcat pilot flying off the Lexington, Alexander Vrachu, knocked 6 dive bombers into the sea in 8 minutes. He was where he was, at the height he was, turned the way he was, because a fighter director in a red-lit room had put him there. The room did not do this by itself, and pretending it did would be exactly the kind of tidy story worth avoiding. The Hellcat had outgrown the worn-out Zero in every way that counted in a fight. American pilots came to the battle with 2 years and hundreds of flight hours behind them, against enemy replacements, some with as little as 3 months in a cockpit. The proximity fuse turned the gun line behind the fighters into something no aircraft wanted to fly through. What the darkroom did was multiply all of it by making sure the better planes and the better trained pilots were in the right place at the right height before the raid ever reached them, so that every other American advantage was spent against an enemy already caught at a disadvantage. Even the count of kills is softer than it looks. The pilots' claims that day, as the historians who have gone back through the records agree, ran about 30% higher than the wreckage could support. Most people will never look any of this up on their own. That is what this channel is for. If you want to keep going, hit subscribe. The Japanese lived through this and never saw the machine that did it to them. Their pilots could tell that the American fighters were always waiting, always at the right altitude, always turned the right way, and they reached for the explanations they could see. Better airplanes, more of them. Luck running against Japan. Some of those explanations were true. The one thing they could not see, because it was buried below an American flight deck and lit in red, was the room where a handful of men had already turned their attack into a diagram before their planes came into range. The same centers would soon be run out ahead of the fleet on picket destroyers off Okinawa, steering fighters against the kamikazes from stations far from anything they were sent to protect. By then, the compartment that had started as one officer improvising in a doorway had become standard fit on every fighting ship the country launched. The men who flew went home with the photographs, the kill tallies, the names in the newspapers. The men in the room, the forestry student and the meat salesman and the professor, went home and slid back out of the record, almost without a trace. The manuals that taught them the job were stamped confidential and marked to be burned when no longer needed. No report of the destruction required. The most important thing the United States Navy took to sea in the last 2 years of the war was a room designed to leave nothing behind, run by men whose names, in most cases, no one ever bothered to write down.